Some people spend their whole lives searching for the one person they can trust. Vincent Moretti spent 10 years making sure no one could ever touch him again. My coffee had gone cold almost an hour earlier, but I kept drinking it anyway because the caffeine was the only thing holding me together after another 16-hour shift at St. Gabriel Medical Center. At 29, I knew every hallway in that hospital better than my own apartment. Every flickering fluorescent light, every squeaky medication cart, every exhausted smile that nurses traded when there were simply no words left. My feet ached inside my worn white sneakers as I scanned the final patient charts before clocking out. The emergency department had finally gone quiet, the kind of silence that never lasted long. I was stuffing my lunch container into my oversized canvas bag when the charge nurse hurried toward me, her expression tighter than usual. "Emily, I know you're off the clock, but we need one more favor." I almost laughed. One more favor usually meant another 2 hours. "VIP admission," she continued before I could answer. "Private floor. They specifically requested an experienced nurse." I sighed and rubbed my tired eyes. "I don't think VIP patients care if I've been awake for 18 hours. She lowered her voice. "This one isn't like the others." 5 minutes later, the private elevator carried me to the restricted wing I'd only visited twice before. The hallway felt different from the rest of the hospital. Too quiet. Too polished. 2 men in perfectly tailored black suits stood outside a closed room without speaking. Neither looked like hospital security. They watched everything. One of them opened the door without saying a word. Inside, expensive medical equipment hummed softly beside a man sitting upright against the hospital bed instead of lying in it. His dark charcoal shirt had been replaced with a simple gray hospital gown, but somehow he still looked like he owned the room. Early 40s. Dark hair brushed neatly back. A few silver strands near his temples. Sharp blue eyes fixed on the city lights beyond the window. He didn't even glance toward me. The air itself seemed careful around him. I checked the electronic chart. Vincent Moretti. No occupation listed. No emergency contact. Every personal detail had been redacted except his allergies and medication orders. Strange. I stepped closer with my tablet. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti. I'm Emily Carter. I'll be checking your vitals." Before I could reach the monitor, one of the suited men quietly cleared his throat behind me. "Miss Carter," he said with calm precision, "there is one rule everyone follows around Mr. Moretti." I turned toward him. "What rule?" His face never changed. "Never touch him." I looked at the man in the bed, then back at the guard. For a second I honestly thought he was joking. Hospitals did not work that way. Patients needed examinations, medications, blood pressure checks, oxygen monitoring. Every part of my job depended on human contact. "I cannot do my job without touching my patient," I answered quietly. The guard did not blink. "Find another way." Before I could respond, a calm voice interrupted us. "Leave." It was the first word Vincent Moretti had spoken since I entered the room. The guard immediately stepped outside, closing the door behind him without another argument. Silence settled over the room again. Vincent finally turned away from the window and looked directly at me. His eyes were colder than I expected, not cruel, just impossibly distant, like someone who had spent years building walls nobody else could see. "You should have listened to him," he said. I gave a tired smile that surprised even me. I have been awake almost 18 hours. I barely listened to myself at this point. For the first time, something shifted across his face. It was not a smile, but it was close enough to make him look unexpectedly human. I rolled my vital signs machine beside the bed and began checking the monitor settings. His heart rate was slightly elevated. Blood pressure stable. Oxygen level normal. Everything looked better than the chart had suggested. "I still need to examine you," I said. "You can refuse treatment if you want, but I still have to ask." He studied me for several long seconds. Most people became uncomfortable when he looked at them that way. I only wondered how many hours he had actually slept. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that expensive suits and private hospital rooms could not hide. "Do you always ignore warnings?" he asked. "Only the unreasonable ones." Another quiet silence filled the room. I reached for the blood pressure cuff, then paused. "May I?" He glanced toward my hand without answering. I took the hesitation as permission. As gently as I could, I wrapped the cuff around his arm. Nothing happened. No sudden reaction. No angry protest. Just the soft hiss of the machine inflating. When it finished, I placed 2 fingers lightly against the inside of his wrist to count the rhythm myself, an old habit I trusted more than any monitor. The instant my skin touched his, I felt his pulse stumble before finding its rhythm again. The door flew open behind me. 2 guards rushed inside so quickly that their polished shoes echoed across the floor. Every face in the room froze except mine because I still had no idea what I had done. Vincent slowly lowered his eyes to where my fingers rested against his wrist. Then, with a voice so calm it silenced everyone else, he said, "Stand down." "She stays." I slowly removed my fingers from his wrist, still trying to understand why everyone in the room looked as though they had witnessed something impossible. Vincent never raised his voice. He simply looked toward the guards, and they immediately stepped back outside, closing the door once more. The silence they left behind felt heavier than before. I finished writing his vital signs into the electronic chart and clipped my pen onto the tablet. "Everything looks stable," I said. "Your heart rate settled down." His eyes remained on me. "You are not curious?" he asked. "About what?" "About why they reacted that way." I shrugged, honestly too exhausted to invent mysteries where none belonged. People have their reasons. My job is to help patients recover, not investigate their personal lives. For the first time, he looked genuinely puzzled. Almost everyone wanted answers. Wealth attracted curiosity the way light attracted moths. Yet I was already organizing medication times in my head instead of wondering who Vincent Moretti really was. After finishing my notes, I excused myself and stepped into the hallway. The same 2 guards stood exactly where I had left them. Neither spoke, but both watched me as I walked toward the nurse's station. I finally clocked out nearly an hour later and drove my aging blue Honda Civic through the quiet streets toward my apartment in Queens. My apartment was barely 600 square feet above a family-owned bakery that started making fresh bread before sunrise every morning. It was small, noisy, and far from glamorous, but it was mine. I kicked off my sneakers, fed my orange rescue cat, Oliver, and collapsed onto the couch before falling asleep with the television still playing softly in the background. The next morning began with another shift, another crowded emergency department, and another endless stream of patients. I assumed the strange encounter from the previous night had already become someone else's story. Around 10 o'clock, Melissa from the front desk hurried over holding a small white envelope. "Emily, this was delivered for you." There was no stamp, no return address, just my name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a simple cream-colored card. "Thank you for treating me like a patient instead of a reputation." Nothing else. No signature. Tucked behind the card was a gift certificate for the coffee shop across the street worth exactly $15. Enough for coffee and lunch, but nothing extravagant. I laughed quietly. Whoever expected expensive jewelry or stacks of cash clearly did not know me. I walked across the street during my break, bought a turkey sandwich and an iced coffee, and thought very little about it. What I did not know was that several floors above the city, inside an office overlooking Manhattan, Vincent Moretti stood beside the window reading a report that contained every ordinary detail of my life, from my nursing school loans to my volunteer weekends at the neighborhood free clinic. After several silent minutes, he closed the folder and said only one sentence. "She still does not know who I am." The following week settled into a rhythm that almost convinced me the strange night on the private floor had been nothing more than an unusual shift. I worked, slept whenever I could, studied for my advanced certification exams, and spent Sunday mornings volunteering at the neighborhood clinic where nobody cared about expensive watches or private elevators. Life made sense there. People thank you with homemade cookies instead of business cards. Then little things started happening. On Monday morning, I found my old Honda sitting in the employee parking lot with 4 brand new tires. At first, I thought the garage had made some terrible mistake. I even asked the parking attendant whether another blue Civic had been parked beside mine. He checked the records twice before shaking his head. "Already paid for, Miss Carter." "By who?" "The gentleman said you would ask that. He told me to say it was someone who appreciated reliable transportation." I spent the next hour trying to convince the manager to charge my credit card instead. He politely refused. 2 days later, the vending machine outside the intensive care unit swallowed my $5 bill before dispensing nothing at all. I laughed, accepted my bad luck, and headed toward the cafeteria instead. The cashier smiled as I placed my tray on the counter. "Already covered." I blinked. "Covered by who?" She pointed toward the window overlooking the city. A man in a gray coat stopped by 20 minutes ago. He only said you should remember to eat on time. I looked outside, but there was nothing except afternoon traffic flowing through Manhattan. My coworkers teased me for having a secret admirer. I laughed with them because that explanation sounded far more believable than the growing suspicion in the back of my mind. 3 nights later, I received another assignment on the private floor. The same hallway, the same quiet, the same guards who now nodded respectfully as I approached instead of blocking my path. Vincent sat beside the window wearing a dark sweater instead of a hospital gown. He looked healthier, though the distance in his eyes remained exactly the same. "You are recovering well," I said while reviewing his chart. "Another day or two, and your physician will probably discharge you. And you sound disappointed," he replied. I laughed softly. "I sound tired." He watched me with an expression that was becoming strangely familiar. Careful, curious, almost cautious. As I prepared his evening medication, I noticed a small paper bag resting on the table beside the flowers. "Those are for you," he said before I could ask. Inside was a fresh blueberry muffin from the bakery beneath my apartment, still warm enough that I could smell the butter. My heart skipped. "How did you know where I live?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the lights stretching across Manhattan. "Because when someone shows me unexpected kindness," he said quietly, "I make certain they get home safely." I wanted to ask another question, but years of working with patients had taught me something important. When people answered only part of what you asked, it usually meant the rest of the story hurt too much to tell. I thanked Vincent for the muffin, set it beside my tablet, and continued checking his chart as though nothing unusual had happened. "You really should stop sending people to take care of me," I said with a small smile. "I can buy my own lunch. I can replace my own tires. And I definitely know where to find blueberry muffins." For a moment, I thought I had finally surprised him. "You noticed," he replied. "I notice everything that affects my patients," I answered. "Occupational habit." He looked down at the untouched cup of tea on the table beside him. Most people would have accepted the gifts without asking questions. I adjusted the blanket over his legs, making sure the monitoring cable was not tangled. Most people probably know how to say thank you better than I do. He studied me quietly. "Then let me make it easier. Tell me what you need." I almost laughed. 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. To my surprise, he smiled. It was brief, almost invisible, but it softened every sharp line in his face. "Besides that," I shook my head. "Nothing. Everyone needs something. Not something money can solve." The room became still again. Outside the window, evening settled over Manhattan, painting the skyline in shades of gold and blue. I finished recording his blood pressure and placed the tablet back onto the counter. "Mr. Moretti, I appreciate your kindness, but I became a nurse because I wanted to help people, not because I expected anything in return." He folded his hands together thoughtfully. "And if helping someone changes your life, then I hope it changes theirs too." He did not answer. Instead, he looked out at the city lights as though my words had followed him somewhere far away. The next afternoon, I was leaving the hospital when heavy rain began pouring across the parking lot. Every nurse around me rushed for cover, laughing as umbrellas flipped inside out in the wind. I pulled my hood over my head and hurried toward my old Honda. Before I reached it, a black luxury sedan rolled quietly to the curb beside me. The driver stepped out holding a large umbrella. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "Mr. Moretti asked that I drive you home." I smiled politely and stepped backward. Please thank him for thinking of me, but I already have a car. The driver hesitated. He insisted, and I am insisting too. I waved, climbed into my rain-soaked Honda, and drove away with the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the storm. Several blocks behind me, the black sedan remained at a careful distance, never passing, never crowding, simply following until I safely parked outside my apartment. From the back seat, Vincent watched the light appear in my kitchen window before quietly telling the driver, "She really means every word she says." 3 days passed without seeing Vincent, and I quietly assumed he had finally been discharged. Life returned to its familiar rhythm of ringing monitors, rushed lunches, and long nights that blurred together until every shift felt the same. Then, just before midnight on Friday, my pager sounded. "Private floor. Room 12. I recognized the number before I even reached the elevator. The hallway was unusually silent when the doors opened. One of the guards gave me a polite nod, but there was something different in his expression. Concern. I entered the room expecting to find Vincent reading by the window as usual. Instead, the lights were dim except for the soft glow of the city outside. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees, breathing slower than normal, but staring at the floor as though he could not quite return to the present. "Mr. Moretti?" I asked gently. He did not answer. His physician had noted that occasional episodes of severe anxiety could interrupt his recovery, usually triggered by memories nobody else understood. I had seen patients trapped inside painful memories before. They rarely needed dramatic words. They needed someone calm enough to stay. I walked over slowly until I stood beside him. "Vincent," I said quietly, using his first name for the first time. His shoulders tightened for a brief second before he finally looked up. His eyes were unfocused, distant, almost lost. "You are safe," I said. "You are here at the hospital. Just breathe with me." I inhaled slowly, letting the silence guide the rhythm instead of filling it with unnecessary conversation. After a few moments, his breathing began to match mine. Without thinking, I gently rested my hand over his, the same simple gesture I would have offered any frightened patient. This time he did not freeze. Instead, after several long seconds, his fingers slowly closed around mine. Not tightly, not possessively, just enough to remind himself that someone was still there. The room remained completely quiet except for the steady sound of the heart monitor settling into a calm rhythm. 10 years, he whispered so softly I almost missed it. For 10 years I could not bear anyone getting close. I waited without interrupting. Someone I trusted once taught me that kindness could disappear without warning. He continued, still looking at our hands. After that, distance felt safer than hope. I understood then that whatever had happened belonged to a chapter he was not yet ready to share. "Sometimes," I said gently, "our minds keep protecting us long after the danger is gone." He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not guarded, not distant, simply tired of carrying the same invisible weight. When he finally released my hand, he gave a quiet nod. "Thank you, Emily." As I gathered my chart to leave, I noticed one of the guards outside discreetly lowering the phone he had been holding. Somewhere else in the city, someone would soon learn that for the second time in 10 years, Vincent Moretti had allowed another human being to reach him. The hospital finally discharged Vincent the following morning, and I told myself that would be the last chapter of our strange friendship. Patients recovered. Nurses moved on. That was how life was supposed to work. For nearly 2 weeks, I did not hear a single word from him. No handwritten notes. No mysterious lunches. No warm blueberry muffins waiting at the nurse's station. Part of me felt relieved. Another part kept glancing toward the private elevator every time its doors opened. Then one rainy Tuesday evening, my volunteer shift at the neighborhood clinic ended later than expected. The streets were nearly empty as I walked the 6 blocks toward my apartment carrying a backpack full of donated medical supplies. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath the streetlights. I noticed the dark SUV only because it had been parked across from the clinic when I arrived hours earlier. It was still there. As I crossed the intersection, the vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb and continued down the street without speeding or breaking any traffic laws. It might have been nothing. New York was full of black SUVs. Still, something about it unsettled me. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions and continued home. The next afternoon, an unfamiliar maintenance worker knocked on my apartment door. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "your building owner requested that we replace the front door lock today." I frowned. Mr. Donnelly never mentioned that. He approved it this morning. Within an hour, the old lock had been replaced with a stronger one. When I called my landlord to thank him, he sounded completely confused. "Emily, I never hired anybody." A chill ran through me. That evening, I stayed late at the hospital trying to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. As I stepped outside just after sunset, I saw Vincent standing across the street beneath the awning of a quiet bookstore. No security surrounded him. No expensive suit. Just a navy overcoat and a paper cup of coffee warming his hands. He walked over slowly, leaving several respectful feet between us. "You look concerned," I said. "I am," he answered honestly. "About me?" He nodded. "Someone has been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" He hesitated before speaking. "Questions about the nurse who treated me differently than everyone else." I searched his face for answers, but all I found was genuine worry. "Vincent," I do not even know what you do for a living." A faint, almost regretful smile crossed his face. That is exactly what I hoped would never change. Before I could ask another question, he quietly placed a small emergency contact card into my hand. It contained only one phone number and one sentence beneath it. "If you ever feel unsafe for any reason, call day or night." I looked up to ask why, but he was already walking away into the rain, and for the first time since we met, I realized the danger surrounding Vincent Moretti might not belong only to him anymore. For 3 days, I carried the emergency contact card in my wallet without telling anyone it existed. I kept convincing myself Vincent was simply being overly cautious. Hospitals had taught me that fear often faded when ordinary life continued, and ordinary life was exactly what I wanted. Then Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a long overdue visit to the neighborhood farmer's market. I wandered between fresh flowers, homemade jams, and baskets of peaches while Oliver's favorite treats sat in my reusable shopping bag. For the first time in weeks, I felt like nothing unusual was waiting around the next corner. As I walked back toward my apartment, an elderly man carrying 2 heavy grocery bags stumbled near the curb. I hurried forward on instinct, catching one of the bags before it hit the ground. "Are you all right?" I asked. He smiled gratefully and assured me he was fine. We chatted for less than a minute before he continued on his way. It seemed like another ordinary act of kindness until I noticed the same dark SUV parked half a block away. Its engine was running. The windows were tinted. It remained there as though waiting for someone. My pulse quickened. I remembered Vincent's warning and, for the first time, I reached for the emergency contact card. My thumb hovered over the number before I finally pressed call. The phone rang only once. "Emily." It was Vincent. He sounded calm, almost as though he had been expecting me. "I think someone has been following me," I admitted quietly. "Where are you?" I told him the intersection. "Stay exactly where you are," he replied. "Walk into the coffee shop on your left and remain inside until I arrive." I followed his instructions without arguing. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans wrapped around me as I stepped inside. I found a seat near the front window, trying not to look nervous. Less than 5 minutes later, Vincent entered wearing a simple charcoal jacket and jeans that made him look almost anonymous. Almost. He walked directly to my table and sat across from me. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No. Did anyone speak to you?" No, his shoulders relaxed for the first time since arriving. I looked at him carefully. "Vincent, what is happening?" He lowered his eyes to the untouched cup of coffee between us before answering. "The world I live in notices every change." His voice remained steady, but there was unmistakable regret behind every word. When people realized I trusted someone, they became curious about that person. I stared at him in disbelief. "Because you trusted your nurse?" He nodded slowly. "Because you reminded me that kindness still existed." The silence that followed felt strangely peaceful despite everything. Finally, he looked up and met my eyes. "Emily, before you walked into my hospital room, I believed distance was the only thing that could keep people safe. You changed that without even trying." Outside the cafe window, the dark SUV quietly drove away, disappearing into afternoon traffic, while for the first time neither of us looked away from the other. 1 year later, my mornings still began before sunrise, but they no longer felt quite the same. The bakery beneath my apartment filled the air with the familiar smell of fresh bread Oliver still demanded. Breakfast before I poured my first cup of coffee, and St. Gabriel Medical Center remained just as busy as ever. Some things never changed. Others changed so quietly that I barely noticed until I looked back. Vincent never asked me to leave my career. He never tried to buy a different version of my life. Instead, he learned the names of my coworkers, donated new equipment to the neighborhood free clinic without attaching his name to a single plaque, and quietly funded nursing scholarships that students would never know came from him. Whenever I thanked him, he always answered the same way. "You reminded me what matters. I am only returning the favor." His world remained powerful, complicated, and filled with responsibilities I would probably never completely understand. Mine remained built around healing, patience, and ordinary people facing extraordinary days. Somehow those two worlds no longer collided. They simply walked beside each other. Every Friday evening we shared dinner at the same little family restaurant where nobody treated him differently from anyone else because the owner cared more about serving good pasta than recognizing important names. Vincent always smiled more there than anywhere else. Sometimes I caught him watching families laugh together across the room, and the distance that had once lived behind his eyes grew smaller every time. One quiet autumn afternoon, he visited the hospital for a routine follow-up appointment. He insisted on checking in like every other patient instead of using the private entrance that had once separated him from everyone else. When I entered the examination room carrying my tablet, he looked up and smiled before I even spoke. "Good afternoon, Nurse Carter." "Good afternoon, Mr. Moretti," I answered with the same playful formality that had become our tradition. I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm and then gently placed 2 fingers against his wrist to count his pulse, just as I had done on the night we first met. His heartbeat remained calm and steady beneath my fingertips. "Everything looks perfect," I said. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. "Not everything. What did I miss?" He looked directly into my eyes, the walls that had once surrounded him now completely gone. "A year ago, I believed strength meant keeping everyone at a distance. You taught me that real strength is trusting the right people enough to let them stay." As we walked out of the hospital together, the afternoon sunlight spilled across the front steps, warming the city that had once seemed so cold. People hurried past us without knowing our story, and that was perfectly fine. They only saw an ordinary nurse and an ordinary man sharing a quiet conversation. They never knew that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could reach a place that years of power never could, because the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones brave enough to open again.